Sion. Widokwa kinat mamdege da jaka sejit no go mami na sewin mamdege kovijin kadege. Widokwa kakina ninjinu and doganac, ninjinu and dognac mam the gain mishum sinan the guk misnan, a shitch ntabano jishak, mam de gay a shitch ninjinu and doganac ya a wensi sa pimis with jik pama de gay jik pamu de gay jik never got to jik me jim with jik. A shitch kakina guchia mishashki metiguk mashkiki Nagdwab dan kakina guch kan sheshkwat ningwe de simen a shishkana noj guch ningwe de simen a shwen mishnon mia miigwech. And again, what I do is I just go around uh, the medicine wheel because that was part of also the creation stories here of our teachings too, that we're all connected to the earth, to the water connects us all, the air connects us all, the fire connects us all, meaning also the sun, which shines on us equally, regardless of our differences, that we're also to as well put here as caretakers, regardless of our skin color, our beliefs, our backgrounds, our language, our history. What binds us together is all these elements. And we were all given original instructions to be caretakers. So this impact assessment is also part of that process to be caretakers. So it's good that we're talking about co-administration today. And we have experts here today, and I welcome them and honor your discussion. So I say, miigwech, and may we have a good discussion, and I'll be listening.
Miigwech, Elder Verna. Thank you so much. Always so good to have you with us. And please feel free to offer any guidance that you want to provide us throughout the session. We're always happy to hear from you. So thank you very much.
Oh, miigwech, Andrea.
Hi again, folks. I think we've had a couple more people join the line. So my name is Andrea Lesperance. I'm a senior policy analyst with the AFN Environment Sector. I'm coming to you from the AFN office on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory. And we're in downtown Ottawa here. This is the fourth webinar in our impact assessment webinar series. We had an introductory session at the end of August. We've had one session focused on the project list and the 5-year review. Last week, we heard from agency representatives on the ministerial exclusion order and our ISK colleagues on the environmental review process. And today we're going to be focused on the Indigenous co-administration regulation and policy approach under the federal impact assessment. We've had a lot of interest in the webinars and particularly in this session. And I think it really highlights the importance of and First Nations interest in co-administration of federal impact assessment. And we've also heard a lot of interest in First Nations-led assessment and making space for those processes as well. So a couple just housekeeping items. So the session is being recorded. The recordings are being made available to anyone who wanted to register for the session but weren't able to make it with us today. The in-camera portions won't be included in the webinar, in the recording, but we will circulate kind of what we heard and any kind of recommendations that come out from them, and just won't attribute those to any one individual speaker unless participants ask us to do so. We do have translation available. So at the bottom of your screen, there is an interpretation button. I do believe that the majority of the presentations today will be in English. So if you're interested in French interpretation, you can select that at the bottom. If anyone does speak in French and you wanted the English interpretation, that's available as well. But it's also an option just to have original audio selected. We do have closed captioning available, and the link is in the chat for closed captioning as well. For any Q&As, we would ask participants, you can either raise your hand and we'll have you unmute and speak to any questions. You can also put any thoughts or questions in the chat, and as a facilitator, I can speak to those for translation, and just so that our presenters don't necessarily have to read it out of the chat, I can do that for them. All of the materials that will be referenced throughout today's session, including the agenda, a backgrounder document, the agency's presentation, and our AFN presentation are all available online at our event page. And I'm going to copy the link into the chat right now. So they are available online right now. So the purpose of this webinar series, we have multiple resolutions that give the AFN Secretariat mandate to work on federal impact assessment policy and regulation. I'll put the link in the chat to the two most recent from 2018 and 2019. But we are mandated to share information with First Nations on policy regulatory proposals from the government and from the Impact Assessment Agency. In order to facilitate dialogue between First Nations and the agency, we are also in a position to put together technical submissions to the various discussion papers that the agency has released and intend to do that as well. So really looking for recommendations from First Nations participants on what you think an AFN technical submission can and should cover, as well as hope you can take any of the information shared today back to your communities or organizations in order to provide those kinds of recommendations to the agency directly. So just hope to facilitate some dialogue on that today. Our agenda for today, so we've got folks from the Impact Assessment Agency with us, as well as the Circle of Experts who co-developed the discussion paper that has been released for comment. And I'll put the link to the discussion paper in the chat as well. We're going to spend about an hour with our agency and Circle colleagues, and then we will turn to an in-camera session led by Jesse McCormick, as an independent contractor who's working with the AFN on our technical submission to the discussion paper. And then we'll wrap up around 3 o'clock, and we'll have Elder Verna do our closing as well. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentations over to Thomas Joe from the Impact Assessment Agency. And Thomas, do you mind just introducing yourself and your agency and Circle of Experts colleagues? And then folks, as you kind of speak for the first time, just give us an introduction to you, and feel free to share anything with folks that you think is important for them to know. So with that, we'll go to Thomas. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andrea. And thank you, Elder Verna, for the opening prayer. Water is something that, from where I'm, is very important, but it's very important across the country and the world. And I always, when I do my land acknowledgement, I often reference water as well. So thank you for that. My name's Thomas Joe. I'm the Director of Indigenous Policy at the agency. And it is my team that worked with a Circle of Experts on the co-administration paper, the co-administration regulations discussion paper, which I'll introduce in a little bit. I come to you from Treaty 1 territory, traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the national homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. And reflecting on the prayer by Elder Verna, I spent a lot of my time in the summer in the waters in Treaty 2, specifically near Kisi-Kawinin Ojibwe Nation, and I get my drinking water from Treaty 3, Shoal Lake 40, and that's something that I always want to acknowledge, given how that weaves into my everyday life. With that, I'll give you a bit of intro on the discussion or the process itself. And then I'll hand over to what I call the people that are the experts on it. We have this ability within the Impact Assessment Act to enter into co-administration agreements once the regulations are developed to kind of support that. And it's ability that's been there since 2019 in the Act. It still remains. And one thing, when the agency seen this bill in the Act, they had to find a way to unpack it and figure out how this could look. And luckily, the agency did not go and do this alone. We looked for help. We through our Indigenous Advisory Committee, we had a subcommittee of a circle of experts, which I'll introduce 2 members in a moment, to help us kind of unpack what could this look like. And a lot of this, what you will see in the presentation, is concepts, a lot of the work that has went in, and what could be, what could this not be, that so forth. And it's really to get the discussion going on what this will look like. And I see this session and future sessions and the comments that will come back as a continuation of that process of getting that input, getting that perspective from Indigenous partners on what these could look like. With that, I will introduce Tayage Alfred, Aaron Bruce, and Mary Nemeth, who will be taking over the presentation, and I'll let them introduce themselves first. I will pass over to Tayage Alfred first.
Yo, sego guego, Tayage, Yurjis, Kahnawage, Nidiwajeno. I'm Tayage Alfred, and I'm from Kahnawake Mohawk Nation. And I've been on the Circle of Experts and really happy to have contributed to the development of this discussion paper and to actually have quite the learning experience being involved and learning from our Circle of Experts and staff from the agency. And I'm really proud of the work we've done. And I'll stop there and just, so we can move on and get to the meat of the discussion here. Now.
Okay, I'll pass it on to Aaron.
Also, Tanoyup, everyone. My name is Aaron Bruce, Squamish Nation. I'm a lawyer. Practice area is rights and title and governance. So by default, I've done a lot of work with nations reviewing major projects and working through environmental assessment, including developing Indigenous-led independent assessments. And I've been happy to participate with the Circle of Experts in with the starting point of co-administration and trying to find a way to build this out to meet the interests of all our nations across the country. So thank you very much.
Okay, and Mary.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Nemeth. I'm the Acting Manager of Strategic Policy in the Indigenous Policy Division at the agency. I'm joining you from just outside of Vancouver in a place called Ladner on the traditional unceded territories of the Tsawwassen and Musqueam peoples. It has been a real pleasure to work with the Circle over the last couple of years, and we also did a lot of learning. So very grateful for the work of the Circle. I'll leave it at that. And Thomas, did you want us to go into the discussion paper maybe?
I think we could jump right in now.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I'll just say thanks very much to Tayage and Aaron as well for being with us. In reviewing the discussion paper, we have found it extremely helpful to have the sections where the agency kind of perspectives and the Circle of Experts perspectives either are the same or different, or there's different viewpoints. And so really appreciate the work that the Circle of Experts have done. And thank you very much for being here with us today, because we really appreciate your time and value your insights. So thank you. And Mary, with that, I think we can launch into the presentation.
Thanks very much, Andrea. So maybe we can start on the next slide then. We're going to talk about the Indigenous Impact Assessment Co-Administration Agreement discussion paper. It's a bit of a mouthful, and our current engagement period. Just want to emphasize that we are really seeking comments on the options and considerations, the benefits and limitations that are set out in the discussion paper. Next slide. Next slide, please. I'm very pleased that Aaron and Ty were able to join us on the call today. So we did work with the Circle for, it was almost 2 years. I'm very grateful for their time and their guidance. I'll talk to you a little bit later about the process of the co-development process, but I wanted to ask Aaron and Ty to talk about the Circle a bit from the beginning of their role in the discussion paper and their participation today. So I will turn it over to Ty and Aaron.
All right. Well, I guess I could start. In terms of the role of the Circle, coming into it, it was apparent to me that there was a good faith effort on the part of the agency to do what Thomas said and not think through this themselves, and to actually engage with Indigenous perspectives on that. And I phrase it that way, Indigenous perspectives, just to make the point clear that none of us are, well, at least I'll speak for myself, but I don't think we were engaged in this process to represent an organization or one of the three groups, First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, or anything like that. We were engaged on the basis of our own expertise and experience as Native people to come into it and to work with the people that were staffing the process from the agency to do the best job that we could here and to offer advice. And so it was clear to me, and it became clear, I think, to the group that it was agency-led. You know, this was an agency exercise and process and so forth, but that there was genuine commitment to taking seriously the input in the process and the guidance that the Circle of Expert provided. And so, Andrea, it was great that you noticed that point, because that was something that we wanted to make sure was very clear going forward, is that there are some differences, and that we wanted to draw out the general point that this wasn't a process of the Circle of Experts, that we were advising the agency and so forth. And so while we're proud of the work, we just need to make that clear, just to keep some integrity to the process and the way that it was structured. And so we met in person, we met online, and we really developed, I think, a good rapport and working relationship and a trust in terms of the integrity of the process that we were committing to and working with. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Aaron.
Well, that was a great background, Ty. Don't have too much to add to it, except to maybe emphasize how interesting it was to have all these different Indigenous perspectives. We definitely all weren't sort of aligned all the time, but we also had some very respectful debate with both each other as the Indigenous representatives and with the agency representatives. And has been said, all of that's reflected in the discussion paper. And I think we see it as a discussion paper, not a position paper. It's very much some thoughts that we had, how this might look, but really looking for input from all the Indigenous communities across Canada to help us understand whether we're all on the same page going forward with this. So yeah, thank you, Ty, for that.
Thank you, Aaron. We can go on to the next slide then, please. So for this presentation, I'm going to introduce the slides, and then Aaron and Ty will speak to the Circle's perspectives wherever they wanted to add more context. So I'll start off by saying that from the agency's perspective, we believe that strong collaboration and partnership between the federal government and Indigenous peoples is critical to achieving the best possible outcomes under the Impact Assessment Act. The Impact Assessment Agency is committed to maximizing partnership opportunities and to seeking the consent of potentially impacted Indigenous groups in a manner that aligns with Indigenous governance and stewardship rights and responsibilities. And then I'll ask Ty and Aaron to speak more generally about the context within which we're working.
Maybe I'll go first again here, because I think that's one of my quotes or something I said in the process. So I'll jump on that one. Yeah, this came, after a few meetings and after some discussion, and like Aaron said, realizing that there are somewhat differing perspectives and different shadings on different issues. We wanted to make clear going forward that we understood as a Circle of Experts that we had a realistic perspective on what this process represented. That it represented an opportunity genuinely for Indigenous governments to get involved in impact assessment in a way that hadn't been possible before, and that it was possible to, if you had the resources and the capacity, and these are all issues that'll be discussed as we go forward, but if you had the means and the ability to be able to engage at a high level, you could take on an authority within this process, which was going to advance, even from the perspective of a First Nations rooted person, your capacity to exercise your self-determination. But it was not an exercise in self-determination, full stop. You know, we were not taking over ultimate authority. We were not taking over decision-making authority. So we wanted to be realistic and making sure people understood, and that any First Nations people that were going to be engaging in this process really understood that this is another tool, and it's a step forward, but it has to be put in the larger context of we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and I think that's a great quote to be included here, and thank you for sort of adding to that, Ty. And I think another thing for us was to try and understand how this might be different than what we're already doing. There's already these opportunities to collaborate through impact assessment and just general consultation processes. But how is this going to be different than that if we weren't getting sort of hitting the home run as we would, we would be thinking of getting full decision-making authority. And so that was an interesting process as well to try and determine how this is a step forward from what we're doing already. And I think we got there. We understood by the end of it that we are taking a step forward here.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Thank you both. We can move on to the next slide then. So again, just in terms of the context here, so the agency has said it is committed to implementing the IAA in a way that aligns with the UN declaration. And as I think Aaron and Ty alluded to, we recognize that this is a work in progress and that there is work to do. Advancing these co-administration agreements is part of a broader Government of Canada commitment. Advancing the regulations is included as part of Canada's Clean Growth Action Plan. It's also mentioned in the UN Declaration Act Action Plan. I don't know, Aaron and Ty, if you wanted to add anything there.
No, I mean, I think that's straightforward.
So on the next slide then, I just wanted to talk a little bit about existing opportunities. So in the introduction to the paper, we set out some existing and past examples of Indigenous leadership and collaboration between the agency and Indigenous governing bodies. To Aaron's point around, being clear on what is currently available and how this might be different. So we set out the current landscape. Really wanted to emphasize also that these existing opportunities for collaboration and leadership will continue to be available. So these arrangements have typically been project specifics. They include things like collaborating on the assessment of the impacts of a project on the exercise of Aboriginal and/or treaty rights, co-drafting the impact assessment report, for example. There have been instances where we have had a joint Indigenous IAC committees that collaboratively undertake parts of an assessment. Also, as it stands now, just wanted to clarify that if an Indigenous governing body decides to undertake its own studies or its own assessment of a project and provides those to the federal process, Section 22 of the Act says that those must be considered as part of the federal impact assessment. So those are things that are currently under the Impact Assessment Act, current opportunities. I think Aaron also wanted to speak a little bit about another example of Indigenous-led assessment outside of the federal process. So I'll turn it over to you, Aaron.
Well, I mean, that was the perspective I was bringing into the circle, working with the Squamish Nation on an independent led impact assessment. And now with the legislation now including a consideration of the results of that assessment, I think obviously is a step forward. But for me, it was coming into it going, okay, well, how can this co-administration process meet the same interests we had in doing an independent assessment? And so that was the lens I was sort of viewing this as. And I think that for me, anyways, that I can see that now that there are opportunities through co-administration of the Impact Assessment Act process and meeting some of the same interests that we were trying to get at, with maybe less resources required to get there, because developing your own assessment process is very resource and capacity intensive. And if there's ways to sort of meet the same interests, then I think we need to consider it. So I just want to give a little bit of context about my sort of background and interest in this process. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. So maybe we can move on to the next slide then. So part of the talking about these other opportunities, we just really wanted to set out what currently exists and then to introduce co-administration agreements as this new tool in the collaboration toolbox. So in addition to what's currently available, what we are calling co-administration is Section 114 of the Impact Assessment Act. So under Section 114, the Minister of Environment is enabled to enter into agreements with Indigenous governing bodies and some other entities to take on certain powers, duties, and functions under the Impact Assessment Act on lands that are specified in the agreements themselves. Under these agreements, Indigenous governing bodies would be considered as jurisdictions for the application of the Impact Assessment Act. And then an important condition is that before being able to enter into these agreements, regulations must be in place. I'll pause. Aaron and Ty, did you want to add anything?
No, not at this point.
There is one question in the chat for Aaron. Lauren, I think it's Lauren. Can you clarify whether First Nations can undertake their own cumulative effects assessment for the impact assessment process? And if they could be conducted prior to a readiness decision? I work with Doig River First Nation. We want to do an initial assessment prior to the IA process commencing.
I'll be honest, I don't know, but I mean, what I would say is that if you want to do a cumulative effects assessment, obviously, as a government, you should do it if you need that information to make a decision. And then it comes down to the negotiation with other levels of government in terms of how you can all coordinate that. Obviously, time is an issue. Cumulative effects assessments take a lot of time and a lot of effort to get done. But under the Act, you may need to ask one of the agency folks here whether that would be considered and how that might fit in. But coming from the perspective of developing independent processes, I would say you should do it in order to make your own informed decisions. And then it's a negotiation with other levels of government to figure out how that can happen.
So thank you. I just wanted to, the section of the Act that I was referring to talks about the requirement is a project specific requirement. So any assessment of the effects of the designated project that is conducted on behalf of an Indigenous governing body that is provided with respect to the designated project. I mean, I think often cumulative effects inform a designated project. I mean, I think it would obviously be considered. I don't know if it's technically a requirement in the Act. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I believe so. Laura, did you want to ask Lauren, did you want to ask a follow-up question, or did you receive an answer to what we were trying to the information you were trying to receive? I don't see any follow-up in the chat. So answered. Thank you. That's great. Thanks, Lauren. I don't mean to put anyone on the spot.
Thank you, Ty. Did you want to add anything?
No, great answers. Just that the previous slide, all of the other ways to engage and so forth. This is one for anybody watching the video from a First Nation support. This was one of the biggest learning areas for myself. Coming from a community And I know there's probably a lot of other communities who haven't had the opportunity under modern treaties or in contemporary law in the legal framework that we operate in now to engage in this type of exercise here. Coming from a community in the East, where all the major projects that are affecting our people and have affected our people were done in a very colonial way through orders in council and just rammed through and done very illegally, I would say. Seeing the range of options to engage on potential developments in our territory was very enlightening for me. And I think that our community's taken a lot away from that. So not only from this project, but learning about the other ways to engage so that we have other options potentially other than our usual dynamic of a proposal and then a blockade.
Thank you both. Yes, thank you. We can move on to the slide now, where this is just a bit of just speaking to what Thomas talked a little bit, alluded to the process already for how we got here. So I just want to go over that very quickly. So the Impact Assessment Act was enacted in 2019. In the years after the enactment, there was quite a bit of engagement, workshops and so on around implementation of the Impact Assessment Act. And so some of that early engagement informed our thinking around co-development. And then we worked with the the Indigenous Advisory Committee on the actual process and established the Circle of Experts as a subcommittee of the Indigenous Advisory Committee. We held our first meeting, I think, in June 2022. So it's been a while. Worked on it for quite a while. There was a bit of a pause during the IAA amendment process, and then published the discussion paper on July 30th. We're planning a 90-day engagement period that will run until October 28th. And then based on what we hear, including the extent to which there's interest in this mechanism, we'd continue on next steps along sort of two parallel tracks, the regulations and policy and guidance. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a few slides. Aaron or Ty, did you want to add anything to the process? I'll go on to the next slide then. Thank you. So as Thomas said, we think of this paper as a diagnostic, and I think the Circle members alluded to this as well. It's not a position paper per se. It really does explore options and considerations and is seeking input on how we could make this mechanism work. I recognize it's a fairly long discussion paper, so I just wanted to explain the structure of it a little bit. We start with the introduction. We talk through the existing collaboration opportunities. We have a governance section where we ask sort of two main questions. So who can enter into a co-administration agreements and where would they apply? We'll talk about those two questions a little bit later in the presentation as well. And then we have a sharing decision-making section that really looks at the powers, duties, and functions that could be available in co-administration agreements and what might be of interest among those powers, duties, and functions. And then we talk through some of the questions around what should be in the regulations, what should be in the policies, what should be in the agreements themselves. And then finally, we identify some things that Indigenous governing bodies may want to consider in terms of capacity or systems that they might want to have in place before entering into these agreements. Aaron and Ty, was there anything else you would want to highlight?
No, not at this point.
So next page slides some of our key findings. So as we've already said, these agreements would be optional. We wanted to emphasize that. And unlike a lot of the existing collaboration opportunities that we've talked about, these co-administration agreements would be long-term, so rather than project-specific. It became clear as we worked through these issues with the Circle that it would likely make most sense for Indigenous groups not to take on the whole federal process with all its process requirements, posting things on the registry, various process steps, and instead to work with the agency to share decision-making at key points throughout the process. And the Circle identified some areas that they thought would be of particular interest to Indigenous groups. We'll have a slide later on where we can walk through what some of those are. We also talked about there being a shared interest in ensuring that timelines are respected and decision processes are defensible, pardon me. And then talked about how agreements would bring greater certainty about Indigenous jurisdictions' roles in future IA processes. I think Erin and Ty, you wanted to speak to some of these points.
I'll just start off because I think I have a very short point in that I was surprised and impressed at the degree of flexibility that the approach is offering here in terms of First Nations being able to pick and choose and being able to enter at certain points and take on roles that really reflect their capacity. And that's something that I didn't really expect going into it, given it's a federal process and my experience in other realms. So I just wanted to kind of make that point going forward, that there is a ton of flexibility, it seems, in offering First Nations the opportunity to kind of tailor their engagement to their needs and their capacities, most importantly, in terms of what they're able to do.
Yeah, and I'd like to support what was just said by Ty, in that I didn't realize as well how much flexibility there could be, and we'll talk more when we get into the specific sort of places where this happens, but it changed my perspective a little bit about the process for sure, where I came in with a different view, and so I thought that was a very positive thing that came out of our process. And, I think the one thing, and I think I saw a question come up about this, the timelines are always contentious based on sort of the First Nations communities' capacity and resources, but also in how an assessment may be done. It's not really a sort of a straightforward linear pathway assessment. It may take more time, and it's a lot more community engagement based, and that we expected that this was going to be a big discussion point, something that comes down to balance in terms of fairness for the proponents who are going through the process, and trying to find that balance with the community. So we 100% expected the timelines would be an issue. That's something that we couldn't really sort of as a circles push to say it needs to be changed, but we did say it does need to be more reflective of how the First Nations communities operate.
Thank you, Erin. Just for the translation and recording, I'll read that second question, and then I'll go to the first. The question in the chat was, I worry about the strictness of the timeline and whether folks presenting could speak to this. So we heard from Erin and the concerns of the Circle of Experts. Mary, if there's anything that you wanted to add on timelines, feel free to do that as well, but I'll just read the first question in the chat was, can you elaborate on the agreement being not project specific? Would it be long lasting agreements with the agency, and is it linked to a geographic zone? And I do believe that another slide further in the deck will cover that, but Mary, did you want to speak to either of those? And then perhaps Erin or Ty, did you want to speak to that kind of second question about the geographic scope rather than project specific?
Sure, thank you, Andrea. So that's exactly right. So the agreements would be long-lasting agreements with the minister, actually, and they would be linked to a geographical zone. And so the challenge, and we'll speak to that a little bit later, is how you identify that geographical zone. But you're exactly right, that is what the agreements would be. I just want to, in terms of timelines, I just want to acknowledge the Circle's perspective and appreciate that will be a challenge. We are constrained by the limits of the Act for this particular mechanism, but recognizing that is an issue, and I've certainly heard that loud and clear. I just wanted to reflect on one last thing that both Ty and Erin raised about the flexibility, and I think that's something that We also really learned from this circle process, because I don't think we recognized that that would be as much of an interest as it was, that there really was an interest in having that flexibility and being able to pick and choose the powers, duties, and functions that would be of interest. And it really opened our eyes also to different ways that we might be able to do this. So thank you to the Gut Circle for that guidance. But I'll turn it over to Erin and Ty again to address the first question.
For myself, yeah, the only thing I have to add to what's been said is that I think that this is, like, in my mind, it represents one of those areas where we can talk about it being a small step forward in recognizing self-determination, because we are identifying kind of a territorial sphere for the exercise of the First Nations jurisdiction, and it's being recognized in a federal process. And so, you know, we have that aspect to it. So that, to me, was one of the more positive elements here. In terms of the timeline, the only thing I have to add there is that in the details of the paper and in the discussions we had, there was definitely talk about the agency having to respect the protocols, the ceremonial, and the type of engagement processes that are meaningful and effective in First Nations, and there is recognition of that as well. So while it doesn't directly address the issue of a hard timeline for the process, there is the point made in the paper that the regulations have to address and respect the need for First Nations to do engagement in their way through the protocols and the community processes that are demanded to achieve authenticity and accountability in that community context.
In terms of the geographic scope, I don't think I'll say too much now. I think we're going to touch on that a bit more when we go forward. But as Ty's saying, anytime that you can get your territory recognized, that's a good thing. But I think a lot of it comes down to our own internal and nation relationships that we need to work through in order for these types of agreements to work. So, but that's all I'll say for now. Thank you.
Thank you both. If there are no further questions, we can go on to the next slide. So potential benefits and limitations. I just wanted to acknowledge that that there are benefits and limitations, that not everyone will be interested in this particular mechanism. From our perspective, these agreements would enable Canada and Indigenous governing bodies to formally share decision-making at key points, and we feel this would facilitate the advancement of Indigenous self-determination. The agreements would contribute to certainty and defensible assessment outcomes. But again, recognizing there are limitations, the processes and timelines under the Act are still mandatory. We've just talked about that. This is still the federal process, and it's not possible to impose requirements that are outside the scope of the IAA using this mechanism. There are challenges, including capacity and territorial overlaps, that may limit uptake. And some groups may well prefer to participate through less resource-intensive means. We're going to talk through a bit more on sharing decision-making and specific powers, duties, and functions that are available. And there are many decision points throughout the IAA that could be included, but just want to acknowledge also that IAC's view is that in most cases, the final determination would rest with the minister or the governing council. And so one of the key questions that we have going through this engagement period for you is, given these benefits and limitations, is this mechanism of interest? But I'll leave that for now, and I think Ty and Erin will have want to speak to the benefits and limitations.
Yeah, the comment that I had here was related to the question at the bottom, you know, where the benefits and the limitations are quite clear. And I think we started our discussion kind of outlining the fact that, you know, this was not the end and the be all end all, that it was a step forward, that there are trade-offs and so forth. And so the real one of the real purposes of this discussion paper is to really determine First Nations interest in participating, and whether or not people who are working in this area in First Nations and representing the collectivities are really seeing this as something worthwhile, that they think is worthwhile investing time and energy into developing and engaging with. So yeah, it's more like framing the question than adding anything new here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much to add to this. I mean, this was some thoughts we had. And, I think, again, this is a discussion paper. We're kind of getting the discussion going by putting some of these things down on paper. But I mean, it's going to be different for every community. And I think that's what we're trying to stress as well, is that every community is going to have its own interests, its own objectives. And there's just different ways of doing this. And like, this isn't just the only way to do it. But if you're going to do it, then you got to go in there, your eyes wide open, and understand what can and can't be done. And on the last bullet point on the limitations and considerations is always a big one in our First Nations communities, about who actually makes the decision, which for the most part, in a process like this could be more of a principle thing than a pragmatic thing, in that you're effectively getting to a decision by running the process, and it's really a strong recommendation that's going to get approved anyways, but who gets to approve it sort of formally is always going to be a big thing in our communities. And obviously something we all have to consider, whether the principle is worth fighting for compared to the result that you're getting by engaging. Again, a lot of this is for discussion, and the interests and objectives of every community is going to be different.
It's an interesting question in the chat from Kim. If you don't mind, I'd take a shot at it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Kim, for that question. My answer to that question personally is yes, but not through this process. That this process is, and the reason that I could kind of justify participating in and trying to make it something that works for First Nations, because it's inherently an area of the exercise jurisdiction where it's normally the federal government and the provinces, and now First Nations would be entering into those dynamics. So it's definitely not a municipal level power that would be taken on. And so just in a kind of a legal or a logical sense, I can look at it that way. But the answer to your question in my mind, and this is outside the scope of our our presentation here, is that most definitely, because there is a governmental agenda to municipalize, and there's a whole bunch of there's a whole suite of legislation, First Nations land management, and here I'm getting into some criticism of things that people may support, but I think there is an argument to be made that there is a federal government agenda on the big picture to create municipal status for our First Nations. But this here is a particular example, I think, of a way to kind of counter that by exercising a scope of authority that is outside of that municipal frame. And so in effect, there's a justification for doing it from First Nations perspectives. That's my answer.
Thank you. And sorry, folks online, I didn't read the question. If you're putting things in the chat, there's an option to send a message to everyone or just to the host and the panelists. So there's a question to the host and the panelists. I will read it now, and I'll make sure that I do in any other case where it's sent directly to us. But Kim had put in the chat, are our communities being turned into municipalities? And that was the question that Tayage was answering. So thank you for answering the question as well. Kim did put a follow-up question. Will this kill our historical treaties doing this? And I don't know if anyone from the agency or the circle wants to address kind of the interaction, or perhaps kind of I don't want to say disagreement, but I'm not coming up with the right word, conflict between exercising co-administration of impact assessment and the historical treaties.
On that last question, maybe we could just flip ahead to slide 17. Sorry to do that to you, Dan, but we'll come back to this this slide after. We do have a slide on modern treaty, well, modern treaties generally. So I just want to emphasize that, and this is also set out in the discussion paper, that co-administration agreements would not infringe on treaties. Treaties are constitutionally entrenched commitments. Canada is committed to meeting obligations under treaties. So full stop. Just in terms of a little bit of that complexity. So some modern treaty partners have existing powers, duties, and functions related to environmental assessment powers, related to environmental assessment of designated projects already. And whether or not they do, they could still choose to enter into a co-administration agreement, might be of interest because the agreements might provide just a mechanism for working together. Co-administration agreements could apply on treaty lands, but they could apply on other lands, broader than treaty lands. So that is an opportunity, but certainly not, again, it's optional. And treaties, as I say, are constitutionally entrenched. These agreements could not infringe on treaty.
And there was another kind of follow-up question in the chat, and maybe Mary or our circle of experts colleagues could answer and speak to the optional nature of any of these agreements. The question is, so if there's a treaty, so the treaty will prevail if there's a dispute. And I think that it's important to highlight that any of these agreements are opt-in and open for negotiation, but nothing is mandatory if First Nations consider that the agreements themselves would potentially implicate their historic treaties in a negative way.
That's definitely my understanding, but I'll let Mary and or Thomas speak to that from the agency's perspective.
Yes, sorry, I just make sure I understand the question correctly. But yes, the treaty will prevail. Treaties are, because they are constitutionally entrenched, nothing in a co-administration agreement would infringe on treaties. That is the...
Yeah, and I would add, Andrea, you also touched on the key part, they're optional. It's something that if First Nation wanted to pursue, it's there, it's an optional tool. And further to what Mary said, depending on the modern treaty region or the self-government agreement, some First Nations already have similar type powers that you could, that they could already be exercising. They're already considered jurisdictions. So maybe this wouldn't be a tool they would actually choose, or perhaps maybe this agreement could further that process, or provide more detail on how that process could work. But the key point being that treaty would prevail on this, and it is an optional tool.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, Mary. Can I just ask you to go back to the slide on eligibility? I think in the interest of time, we want to try and go through some of the substantive slides to make sure folks online get all the information available.
Thanks, Andrea. Right. So this is who eligibility for entering into agreement. So it would include an Indigenous governing body, which is defined in the Act as a council or government or other entity that is authorized to act on behalf of an Indigenous group recognized under Section 35. Some Indigenous governing bodies already have environmental assessment powers, as we mentioned, others do not. For the purposes of co-administration, both categories are eligible to enter into a co-administration agreement. So any Indigenous governing body would be eligible. There are also a few other bodies that would be eligible. So these are essentially the like a co-management body established under a land claim agreement that has environmental assessment power. So these tend to be the co-management boards in Northern Canada are also eligible. I don't know, Ty or Erin, if you'd like to speak to this slide or to the need for transparency.
No, I just maybe gets at the question that Abraham was asking in the chat. And I mean, what it does come down, it doesn't erase or obviate the need for internal politics and discussion and negotiation, because of course, you know, there could be a group potentially that contends that it has the right to negotiate in this territory. But I think in the bubble there's an important point to be made, which is that authorized to act on behalf of is pursuant to Indigenous legal processes and standards, and consistent with the UN Declaration. So there is a framing of that discussion that references our own Indigenous processes for determining who's eligible and the legality of someone's claim and so forth. And I mean, we could go into another couple of hours discussion about false claimants and collectivities that don't actually have rights, that are claiming rights today in Canada and so forth. But I think this gets right to the point.
Erin, did you want to add anything?
No, not really, but I think, I mean, just having this discussion right now is reflective of what we're talking about in the circle, in that some of the challenges around, you know, who is authorized, and then who determines who is authorized as well. And again, I think our conclusions are we got to reach out to the communities and get that information to understand, you know, what the thoughts are around that, because it is a challenging issue. It's a challenging issue that I don't know that there's any straightforward answers that we could sort of blanket through a process like this, that there's so many individual ways of doing this and ways of wanting to do this. So, you know, it probably sounded like a non-answer, but I think that's where we went in the circle. It was a bit of it was a circle. We were going around quite a bit trying to figure out how this could best work under this process.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah. So, and there's also the next slide. We'll deal with another question that's also challenging. And I think just wanted to underscore a couple of things that the circle talked about in the discussion paper as well, is the need for transparency and however you do this. And there were some suggestions thrown out that, which again, we're seeking comment on. One was that you could have a self-assessment process to talk about eligibility and where agreements would apply and readiness and so on. And then potentially, I think the circle was suggested you could have a body maybe made up of Indigenous representatives who could provide advice on these questions. But again, these are sort of ideas that were thrown out to talk about these challenges, and we're very much seeking input on how on these ideas and others that you might have for transparency and for making these determinations. I'll just move on to because I think this is also a very thorny question, and where we talked a lot about with the circle was, where would the agreements apply? And what do you do in particular in situations where there is a history of shared use and occupation? And the circle, in talking with the circle, we sort of landed on 3 ideas, or maybe categories of ideas, on how you could set up agreements in these situations. One might be that you would have multiple Indigenous governing bodies, if they choose to do so, to work together through a tribal council or another joint entity. Another option might be, depending on the circumstances in that particular geographical area, maybe it's appropriate that one Indigenous governing body is the jurisdiction in this particular area, and that we continue to consult, as we currently do, with other Indigenous governing bodies who might potentially be impacted by a project. And then the third option that was discussed was the potential for having multiple Indigenous governing bodies with agreements in the same lands, with the trade-off being that then you would have potentially less powers, duties, and functions within each agreement. So you might, for example, have each group would have the duty to assess impacts on the rights on their own rights within that territory. If you had multiple groups with agreements. So these are, I'm running through this very quickly. They're set out in a bit more detail in the governance section of the discussion paper, and I really invite you to reflect on those, and we'd love to hear suggestions, and then I'll turn it over to Aaron and Ty for discussion.
I feel like I've been jumping in first every time, Aaron. I don't know if you wanted to say something. No. Okay. Yeah, I don't know about if I have anything to add on this one. Mary, you did a really good job of making it clear in terms of where we came to. Just so everybody who's participating in this understands, we did have quite the long and detailed discussion about all this, because I think it's such a real issue. You know, this is something that we're dealing with not only in this process, but in all kinds of processes here with this overlap, and sometimes getting played by government and then sometimes playing ourselves. And now we really have to think about that in the context of this process here. And so these are the options that I think the circle and the agency came to as possibilities, you know, that had some logic to them, that made sense in the context of the law and so forth. But the number 4 here, other, and the question after, this is really, and this is a reminder for the whole purpose of this exercise, which is not to kind of say what's what, but to have people, to draw people into a conversation and discussion, and have people hopefully suggest a whole set of other options or better thoughts on this rooted in their experience. So just to say that, you know, this is not meant to be comprehensive or limiting in any way. These options that are presented here are based on our own experience as people working in the First Nations context, but they're conversation starters.
Absolutely. And if I could just interject quickly, and then maybe Aaron, if there's anything that you wanted to add, we can go to you as well. But it's a really good reminder too, that this discussion paper should be like a launching off point for discussions. And in kind of planning the webinar, we've asked that the agency folks make themselves available to any of the First Nations reps that are on the line or weren't able to tune in to the session today, to have those one-on-one discussions and kind of continue the work as well, so that folks can get as much information as they need in order to really substantively kind of provide recommendations on these questions that are posed. So thank you for that reminder as well. Aaron, is there anything that you wanted to add to this slide as well?
I do, and maybe folks at the agency might not like my addition here, but something we did have much discussion on was like when does this happen? Does it happen, you know, before you can sign a co-administration agreement, or is it something that you sign the co-administration agreement as sort of a single entity and then figure out the sort of the nation to nation stuff after, once you find out where a project's going to be. And you know, there's challenges with both. Like if you can't come to an agreement with all your neighbors before a co-administration agreement is signed, you don't get into a co-administration agreement. And then the other issue is if you, you know, go in on your own and sign it, and then you can't resolve those other nation to nation sort of boundaries and shared territory issues, you can't get going on the assessment. So it's something we talked about, and I don't know that we came to resolution. I know what the agency's perspective is, but it's something that you know, I have concerns with of when it happens, but that's something for discussion, and hopefully we get some feedback on that. Is when is the best time to sort of get this sorted out before we go into these agreements.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron.
I'll just speak to the comment in the chat, every province and nation has different resources, and those things must be taken into consideration as well.
Yes, I think that's also a point that the circle made quite strongly, just to be aware of in discussions as well, to be aware of different capacities and to ensure that those are considered. So maybe we'll go on to the next slide, recognizing that there is this is a discussion provoking slide meant to ask for input. Here again, we talked a bit about what co-administration agreements would do is enable an agreement where the Indigenous governing body would take on powers, duties, and functions under the Impact Assessment Act. And I think I alluded to this earlier, that in discussing with the circle, we came to the realization that it probably made more sense to take on parts rather than the whole process with all its requirements, and then which parts would be of interest. So that we talked about that with the circle. Just wanted to clarify that the powers, duties, and functions that are available are the ones that would be potentially between the planning and the decision-making phases. So the only one that's explicitly excluded would be around the designation decision, sorry, not designation, the Section 16 decision as to whether an assessment is required. But it also wouldn't include anything before the planning phase, so anything such as designation, for example, or after the decision-making phase, such as monitoring and enforcement. Those are things that are outside the scope of what a co-administration agreement could do. So within that scope, so what are the powers, duties, and functions that would be of interest? What the circle suggested is that Indigenous jurisdictions focus their resources on activities that would be most likely to influence the assessment process as well as the final outcome. And so came to a list of sort of the ones that might be of most interest. But I just really wanted to underscore that, and maybe Erin and Ty could speak to this as well, is that this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. So this is a recommendation of certain powers, duties, and functions that could have a high impact on the process, but Indigenous governing bodies could negotiate different ones, and this is not meant to be an exclusive list of what would be available. And one of the questions that we really want to ask you is what are the roles or decisions that would be of interest? And I'll turn it over to Ty and Erin.
Yeah, just to add my perspective on this one here, it's something again that I learned going through this. And when I mentioned earlier, and when Erin and I spoke about how impressed we were about the flexibility in the process, this is the real one of the main areas where there is flexibility kind of manifested. And so to me, what this means here is that First Nations have the opportunity to come in at the various key stages of the process where products are issued, decisions are made, and so forth. And so if you have the interest in one of those or one or other of those stages, you can just participate in that. You can participate in 2 or 3, or you can try to take on the whole process yourself. But to break it down in simple language for those who are coming at this in the first instance here, you can participate and help guide and influence the way the work is done, the impact assessment. You can impact the report itself. You can look at participating and influencing the conditions that are placed on a project as a result of that report. And then also the final determination if you choose to. So there's these kind of key turning points in the process. And that's what this refers to. Which one or how many do you want to, as a First Nation, take responsibility for engaging with?
Yeah, so for me, I sort of opened this conversation today with like, how is this different than just participating in a collaborative way? You can kind of come in with a collaborative agreement with the agency and work through it. But I found through this process and the discussions we had in the circle that the Indigenous governing body has a lot of influence over this process at these key points, rather than in the collaborative process, you might be inputting information. And then at the time of the result of the assessment is where you kind of really engage again. Where here, and getting kind of to making a decision. If you're in a position to make a decision right at the tailored impact statement guidelines of what information needs to be included in the assessment, it's better to be having some influence here at this stage rather than at the end going, well, we should have had this in the assessment. And so I find that if you're able to make those decisions through these sort of, particularly the first couple of areas, you're kind of making it your own assessment. And so I found that this was key to me at these points, and understanding that flexibility of what we could bring in, because obviously when you're running this assessment, you're under the Impact Assessment Act and under the existing regulations. But what we discovered was that, well, there is a lot of room to ensure that you're getting the right information that that your community wants, and then having that opportunity to say, well, whether that's good enough or not from your community's perspective. And so those first two bullet points there, to me, are key in my experience of going through an assessment, because usually First Nations communities are just inputting information that others are controlling. And in this way, the Indigenous governing body is able to say, well, this is the information we need. This is not good enough, or this is good enough in order for us to move to the next step. Yeah, that's a lot of control. And so that was key to me in the way that I've experienced impact assessment, and kind of lessened my positioning on the final decision. When we get to the final decision, if you're able to control it through this place and kind of get all the information you need, be able to assess whether it's good enough, then sort of write the report from your perspective that sort of your own community can understand, then you've kind of got there without having to make that final decision. Obviously, I'd love to have the party making the final decision, but for me, this was really important, and what I really focused on in the process, and was really happy with that. And that I think I started as well saying, well, when Squamish ran its own process, how would this process be able to meet those interests that we were trying to meet in our independent assessment? And I was seeing that when we started talking about this piece. So thank you.
Thank you. There's one question and comment in the chat that I'll read and ask if anyone wants to answer, and then just to follow up as well. So the question in the chat: the government has been asking all nations across Canada to sign agreements that we can't ever go back on, past, present, and future lawsuits. So doing this, how will this affect all our nations? We have a duty to protect Mother Earth, the water that is highly sought after, and the future generations. And perhaps maybe one of the things that could be touched on is what happens if there's an agreement in place and a dispute arises. Is there a mechanism to dissolve the agreement if the First Nation or the Indigenous governing body isn't happy with how things are going?
That's an excellent question, Andrea. And I as much as we've talked over a lot of the issues, there's always new ones and new considerations. So really appreciate that thought. So this is something that could be negotiated as part of the agreement itself. So we have a section on agreements where we set out what are the kinds of things that you could put into an agreement. And so this would be an interesting idea to also include some sort of a mechanism for how you get out of an agreement if it's not working for the parties. So yeah, very interesting. And so thank you for that.
Yeah, I would just like to add, that's, I think, the exact type of feedback we want to get through this process is, what could, what could or should be in agreements, right? I know the Circle and Mary's team have done a lot of work on the paper, and they've touched on a lot of things, but also hearing from everyone on the call, or even through the comment period, anything else that they see could be something for us to consider as we move this forward. I know Taige and Andrea, you mentioned that it's a process, or Andrea may mention this is kind of the launching point, and that's so true, right? We have this paper, it's a product, but it's also part of a process, and getting that information back is going to help us as we chart the way forward. Specific comes down to, further information on what agreements could look like, and some concerns with those as well.
Thank you. Was there anything that Taige or Aaron you wanted to speak to? Okay, thank you. So there's a couple more comments and questions in the chat. Does anyone realize the amount of water that's going to be used or needed to mine and process green energy? And another is, if the intention is for co-administration, why does the final determination rest with the minister or the governor and council? Can the minister/governor and council's determinations be appealed? And I think if we're talking about the limitations, perhaps, of what a co-administration agreement could address, I think that in kind of preliminary discussions with the agency, we've said that there shouldn't be a interpretation of the requirements of the Act that scope down what's available to Indigenous governing bodies. Mary, can you speak to the specific exemption of Section 16 screening decisions, and also perhaps the ability or not for Indigenous governing bodies under a co-administration agreement to make determinations on Section 9 and designation decisions as well?
Thanks, Andrea. Yes, sorry, we skipped one of the slides, so as we were trying to get through a little more quickly. So that's a great question. So under the Act itself, the Act sets out what can be included in co-administration agreements, and it says that it must be in relation to impact assessment. So from the planning through to the decision-making phases. So Section 9 comes before a project assessment, so it's before the planning phase. Section 9 is the designation decision. So we currently have a regulation that sets out the projects that would be subject to an assessment. In addition to that, the minister has the power to designate a project that's not on the list. That's what Andrew's asking about with respect to Section 9. So because that's not part of the impact assessment, it wouldn't be available through this mechanism. And Section 16 is the decision as to whether an assessment is required, and it is specifically exempted by the Act. So and we can talk about this a little bit on the next slide, but we have the Act sort of sets out the requirements and what is possible to include in the regulations, and the Act specifically excludes Section 16. So I take the point that there would be interest in both of these mechanisms. It's just not possible through this particular mechanism, given what the Act, because the Act is what enables the regulations. Does that address the point you were asking, Andrea?
Yeah, was there anything else that folks wanted to add about the final determination?
And sorry, yeah, apologies, Andrea. You were asking about that as well, and I'll let Aaron and Ty speak to that as well. We do discuss it in a fair bit of detail in this shared decision-making section. There's a subsection on the final determination that really walks through sort of the Circle's perspective, but also the agency's perspective on what are the kinds of things that would have to be in place in order to share the decision, the final determination, that it would more likely to be shared rather than done independently, and the certain circumstances such as a strong connection to lands, for example, that would be. But I know we've got a limited time, and I don't want to shortchange that particular discussion. It is set out in a bit more detail in the discussion paper. But let me turn it over to Ty and Aaron if they wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, just to make clear, this is something we've been talking about the whole time about, and Aaron's point, ideally, we would be making that determination. This would be a true nation-to-nation relationship, and the Crown would be relating to us as nations and giving us the respect of our own authority in our own territory. But we don't live in that country right now. We live in a country that's trying to move forward to have a greater respect for our own authority and our own nationhood. So that's being realistic. And that's the whole context for this discussion and engagement. And so the one practical answer to Kanisha's question is that it used to be called, when we first started, Indigenous-led collaboration agreements. But because of this point, it's been retitled co-administration agreements, because it's not, we don't want to give the impression, well, it's one of the reasons, but we don't want to give the impressions that this is an Indigenous-led process, when in fact it's going to be a very rare instance, if at all, as Mary alluded to, where the minister is going to give the First Nation the ability to make the final determination. It hasn't happened yet, and the scenario that would happen is hard to imagine from a First Nations perspective at this point, being realistic. So to be reflective of the actual reality, it's co-administration, and that's why the word administration is used. It's the administration of the process leading to a decision.
I don't know if this is a place to bring this up, but I think it is another awareness piece, is that there's accountability with making decisions, and if Indigenous governing bodies are now making a decision, running a process, the administration, and making a decision, there is a legal side to this. And one of the things we were discussing and grappling with is, could the First Nation be subject to a judicial review based on running the process and the accountability in that process, and who's making that decision. And so, that's something to consider as we go through this. With decision making comes responsibility, accountability, and fairness. And I don't know if this was the place for it, but this is a decision making place for it, and it is something that we did discuss. And so sometimes you want to kind of consider whether you want to be the one making a final decision in a situation like this, and who's responsible legally for that decision. Again, not providing advice or anything here. I'm just saying that that's something that needs to be considered when making decisions.
There's a thanks for that clarification in the chat. That was very helpful. I will say too, so usually ministers' decisions can be appealed through judicial review. While we're talking about it, I'm wondering whether an Indigenous co-administration agreement could set out an alternative dispute resolution mechanism, where an Indigenous governing body would have a different route to appeal decision rather than judicial review because of the nature of the agreement. I'm not sure if that's something that's been considered in the development of the discussion paper. But maybe one of the things that can be suggested.
Thanks, Andrea. I have not heard that suggestion before. So yeah, really interesting. I'd love to explore that idea. I know we're running out of time. I'd really like to get onto a couple of more points if we could. Is that all right if we move on?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's just
Or,
one
sorry, are
question.
there other questions? Apologies.
There's
Andrea.
just one more comment in the chat, and I'll read it, and then you can go on to the next slide if there's nothing in particular that you wanted to share. But how do we make sure that other governing bodies outside of our country don't try and overpower us and what's best for us here in Canada? Maybe that's one of the kind of considerations that can be discussed in one-on-one meetings. And Mary and Thomas, I'll just ask you to put at the end of the session, just put your email in the chat, see if anybody wants to follow up with you on that.
Absolutely, yeah. And also it's something that just as a consideration that we would have to think through as well in through this process. So take that point. So I just wanted to talk about this. I'll try to get through this very quickly. It's we wanted to talk about the where we're at sort of in the process and some of the questions that we have, specific questions about the regulation. So in terms of seniority, if you will, the Impact Assessment Act is at the top. The act is passed by Parliament. The act enables the cabinet to enact regulations. And then under that is the policy and guidance that fleshes out the details. The policies and guidance are usually developed by the agency itself. So we're asking about this middle layer, the regulations. So these can either be very complex, so they can really set out all the details for these agreements, or they can be relatively simple and just basically authorize the minister to enter into agreements, and maybe add a few other important matters, and then you could flesh out the details in policy and guidance. So if the regulations are quite simple, if they're not too prescriptive, then it would allow parties to negotiate on a nation-to-nation basis agreements that are tailored to the diverse evolving needs of rights holders. The other advantage of simple enabling regulations is that they could be enacted more quickly. To some extent, that's what it comes down to, is sort of how soon would you want to have regulations in place? Do we want simple enabling regulations, or would you rather sort out more details and constraints in the regulations, and then that would take a bit longer? The question we're asking is so what are, if we do have simple enabling regulations, are there, what are some important matters that we could still include in those regulations? What would be the most important to include, and what should be covered in policy? So I just wanted to flag this question for you. All the questions are set out in the discussion guide at the end as well. I know Ty or Aaron, you might have some comments on this as well. I know there's some considerations around transparency that you also had raised during our discussions.
I'm fine with the way you explained it.
Yeah, I think I was just thinking back to some of our discussions, and I think obviously the pros and cons of policy is that it's more flexible and can change a lot easier than regulations. And it was just sort of getting into whether policy is co-developed as well, as compared to, like, the regulations would go through this process that we're going through now, but whether the policy would be co-developed, and changes would be sort of bringing in Indigenous governing bodies as well, so that it's not just the discretionary thing for the federal government to do, to change policy when they feel like it, and when the political winds change and things like that, that the policy would be just shifting without that input from the Indigenous governing bodies. But other than that, I think that was a good summary of it, Mary. Thank you.
Andrea, how are we for time? Do we have time for 2 more slides?
Sorry, I was trying to find my unmute button. Yes, go ahead.
We can skip over this one. I think we already addressed the treaty slide. I just wanted to talk a little bit about, so co-administration agreements would apply to federal powers. We've talked about that, but and also that being considered a jurisdiction would apply under the IAA, not to other legislation. But we also just wanted to really recognize, and this is a point that the Circle made as well, that we need to work in coordination and cooperation with provinces and territories, just given that they're already operating in this space. So the agency is committed to cooperation, and that would continue in the context of co-administration agreements. IAC wants to work with proponents as well, just to figure out how we can make these agreements work. And we would very much welcome ideas on how to do that. So how can we work with other jurisdictions? How can we work with proponents to support successful implementation? Ty and Aaron, did you have anything to add?
Not on my part.
I'll go on to the next slide then. This is our second last slide. So the comment period runs until October 28th. I think Brittany's put our contact information in the chat, so please do reach out if you have any other questions. The discussion paper is posted online, and there is a mechanism for either typing in comments directly or you can upload a submission. So we really are hoping to hear from you. We will be summarizing what we heard in the fall and what we heard report. What we learned from this engagement will inform the development of regulations and policy and guidance. The agency really recognizes that neither the government nor Indigenous groups have experience building this kind of partnership. We're committed to learning together and taking the time to work in collaboration and to remain flexible and changeable to meet evolving needs. I will flag that there is a discussion guide at the end of the discussion paper with a lot of questions for you, but also just welcome general comments. And as we've seen already from the discussion today, sort of comments on things we haven't even raised in the discussion paper. So very, very much welcome input. And I'll leave it to Ty and Aaron to finish up.
Well, I mean, just to reiterate that, we were a small number of people representing an Indigenous perspective, and I think we brought a lot of experience, but it was very particular to ourselves, and we tried to put our minds to the broader issues and so forth, but there's no way that we as a circle, given the small number of people we had, could think of all of the different situations and all of the different inputs and answers and so forth. So I think you saw it just today, Andrea's participation gave 2 great points going forward. And so if you have the time, if you have the energy, if this is of interest to you and to your First Nation, I think it's well worth the time that you're going to put into it to send them the comments and the questions and the input that you have, because our experience is that it'll be taken seriously and fed into the process.
Yeah, no, I was really impressed with the questions that were asked today. Some that I don't think we thought of, and others that we did think of that we're happy is going to be reflected in the comments coming back. And I'm really looking forward to seeing these comments. We put a lot of time and effort into this, and a lot of debate and deliberation to sort of get to this. And as Ty said, I think we're all very happy with it in the end to start a discussion. And so I wanted to thank everybody for their great questions today and for listening to us. Thank you.
Thank you. There was one question in the chat, and then maybe we'll go to Elder Verna. I see her hand up. Can you confirm that the comments and submissions are to be submitted through letstalkimpactassessment.ca, or can they be emailed directly?
So whatever suits best. The Let's Talk Impact Assessment site has a place where you can just type in comments or upload submissions. We're also very happy to receive emails if that's easier.
Thank you. Elder Verna, did you want to ask a question or offer any information?
Just a really quick observation here, because you're just like you're in an evolutionary learning, like a Hansei process, where you have this PDCSA cycle too as well. And because it's new territory really, but again, when you're going through that process too, because now you're incorporating like this also the traditional knowledge of the lands too, which go back further than even Confederation. So again, to the other part is now as you're going through this process to with impact assessment, what's the institutional capacity also to gather this information, and that ties back to this even as they're all talking about artificial intelligence too in your databases too, because again, as you're really on an evolutionary learning. The other part where when I was listening into, because having sat on this nuclear discussion, at the end of the day, it was really the minister and really prime minister who overrides the decision regardless of what the impact assessment or any issues. And sometimes what they hide under is also because it's in the public's best interest. So again, too, as well, it's defining what's in the public's best interest. The public's best interest for the government is also the growth of the gross national product, the gross domestic product. That's in the public's best interest. But what happens still too as well when it doesn't, for example, with the due diligence and risk assessment. So again too as well, I think there's a flushing out on there because this impact assessment now needs to have more of the teeth because it is in the public's best interest. And sometimes the public's best interest is a no-go, but it's overridden by the political process. And again, too, as well, and that goes back now into the legal process, or it just dies, and the project was meant to be pushed ahead anyway. So, but you can't do that anymore because of the times we're in, and that's just an observation. So, miigwech.
Thank you, Alder. I'd like to say, well, sorry, did anyone from the agency or the circle want to address any of the information that Elder Verna shared? Okay, thank you. I'd just like to say thank you to Thomas and Mary from the agency and the other agency folks that are online helping behind the scenes. The link to the Let's Talk Impact Assessment is in the chat, as well as the email for the general inbox. There was a couple requests to connect directly with Mary and Thomas, and I can make those introductions after. So we'll follow up with the folks who wanted to do that. And really like to extend a big thank you to the two folks from the Circle of Experts, Tayayage and Aaron. Thank you very much for being with us. And really appreciate all the work that you've done on the discussion paper. And we'll definitely be submitting the technical submission and would just ask the agency folks to be flexible in timelines, receiving submissions from any of the First Nations representatives who are interested in doing that as well. And I think with that, we'll ask our presenters to depart, and we'll do just a few minutes of in-camera session and have Jesse walk us through a little bit of information. And note, Julia, that you wanted to be in contact with Mary and Thomas as well, so we can follow up. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you very
No, I
much.
agree.
Thank you, Elder Verna.
Really
Thank you,
wonderful.
everyone.
Yeah.
Alder Verna, was there anything else that you wanted to share while we were just transitioning to the in-camera session with Jesse?
No, I was just going to ask about does impact assessment have an ombudsperson specifically because NRCan just has a new ombudsperson specifically for labor relations. And but I wonder though too as well if there's an ombudsperson now needed, or they already have one for impact assessment.
I don't know the answer. My thought is no. I do know that the Office of the Auditor General is available to do studies that implicate like the Minister of ECCC and the work of the agency. Jesse, did you have any more specific information about the existence or non of an ombudsperson, or any suggestions to create one?
I've done a brief check. I think it's a very good question. I'm not aware of, and I don't believe there is one. I think that it may provide a new mechanism, something to look at, but I don't think they've instituted anything of that nature, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada.
Yeah, and that's the other part though too as well, because then when I was talking about like they use this to push a political agenda through in the public's best interest. So then maybe that's where does the Privy Council come in as an interceding?
The impact- oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's just observations I'm putting through, but because again, why I'm saying that too as well is that there's that evolutionary process, and but at the same time, it gets overridden, and for political points or political brownie points, when in reality is to as well maybe as a added, maybe a re-review even of all the work impact assessment does with now, even with the co-administration, what is the role of the Privy Council as a third party as well, or the ombudsperson, as opposed to going to the judicial system, which could be costly, time consuming.
I think you and Andrea are thinking along the same lines. Andrea mentioned the idea. So there's some good ideas coming from the First Nation side of the table here. So I think that's something that that merits further reflection. And there's probably some problems that could be solved if there was an effective dispute resolution process.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Jesse, we've got a couple minutes left, and I think what I'll ask you to do is just highlight for folks, was there anything that the agency didn't cover in the discussion paper that you think it would be particularly useful for folks on the line to consider, perhaps in the discussion paper itself, or just generally when like reviewing the content of the paper? And I can share my screen, and if you wanted to point to any slides, but not necessarily as well. So I'll leave it to you for what you want to.
That sounds great. Well, first of all, good to see everyone. I'm Jesse McCormick. I'm supporting the Assembly of First Nations in a legal and consulting capacity on this project. I'm a lawyer in Ontario and British Columbia. I'm joining you from Secwepemcúlecw, the traditional unceded territory of the Secwepemc people. I'm on the reserve at the Kamloops. And I'm Anishinaabe from Ontario, Chippewas of the Thames, Deshkanziving. So Bochokanoya, and my father's from Batchewana and grandmother's from Oneida Nation of the Thames, Onyadoks, Namwolf Clan Oneida. So I'm pleased to be doing this work. I'm pleased to be helping out. I was also part of Catherine McKenna's team in Environment and Climate Change during the development of C69. And I was legal counsel on the recent Impact Assessment Act referenced opinions. So I've been in and around some of these questions for quite some time. We've got a deck. It was available in your materials. We won't go through it just given the time frame, but I might get us to jump to a couple of specific slides. Andrea, do you have the deck available, or did you want me to? I don't know if I have sharing capability. So what I would suggest we do, given that we're close to the finish of the line here, let's jump to slide, I believe slide 13. So Mary touched on this concept briefly. Where we are in the process, if you have the Impact Assessment Act, which entered into force in August of 2019, when they passed two regulations, the Time and Information Management Regulations and the Physical Activities Regulations. And since then, they've been tinkering but not doing much in the relation to the Indigenous Co-administration Agreement regulations. So now that they've conducted the necessary work with the Circle and set out a discussion paper, they face a choice about what should be, and this is that pyramid that Mary showed on slide 16 of the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada's presentation, where you had the Impact Assessment Act at the top, the Indigenous Co-administration Agreement regulations in the middle, and then policy and guidance. And the question they're trying to figure out is, what should they be putting into the regulations? Should they be building out very deep and dense regulations with lots of content and laying out a lot of the solutions to a lot of the questions that they were discussing today? Or should they do what's called enabling regulations, which is putting forward a more bare bones version of what the regulations are, with the intention of empowering policies and agreements to do the real work of setting up what First Nations and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada can agree upon in an individual co-administration agreement. So what we've proposed here, and what we're seeking your feedback on, is the idea of offering support for the idea of enabling regulations. And part of that is the political context. Many of you may be aware that the government of Canada is currently governing in a minority parliament. So the governing party, the Liberal Party of Canada, has less than a majority of the seats of the House of Commons. Until recently, they were supported by the New Democratic Party through a confidence and supply agreement. The New Democratic Party has recently discontinued their support through that agreement. And now every time the government brings forward something in a confidence motion, they've got to find a dance partner, whether it's the Bloc, the Conservatives, the NDP. So we do have a somewhat more precarious minority government. And there's always the risk that if this work doesn't advance prior to an election, that it could get lost, or if there's a new government, they may not put the same emphasis or may not want to pursue the same policies. So viewing this as a positive opportunity in the sense that most of the powers that are being discussed in relation to the Indigenous Co-administration Agreement regulations were not present in SIA 2012 and are currently not able to be exercised because they require the regulations before First Nations can enter into agreements. We're suggesting it would be a good idea to support the proposal to utilize enabling regulations because they'd be faster. They would have a broader scope, so you can lay out what could be possible and allow individual Indigenous governing bodies or First Nations to enter into direct discussions with the Government of Canada about their individual agreements. And it also allows policy to evolve over time, or agreements to evolve over time. So rather than take more time to put in more content now, we're suggesting it would be a good idea to say, yes, agency, it would be a good idea to have this be just enabling, just recognize the powers, pass some regulations, get those on the books before an election, and that way they're in force and in effect for some time. So maybe I'll pause there, Andrea, just to see if there are any questions or if there's any feedback on that proposal.
Thanks, Jesse. I do have the chat open. If anybody wanted to put questions or comments in the chat about Jesse's suggestion to recommend the adoption of enabling regulations, feel free to do that. But we can also have folks, if you wanted to raise your hand and just speak to the question. Oh, so spotlighted your video. Okay, so you can all see me, so that's great. Did anybody want to either raise their hand or put any kind of feedback in the chat on the question of enabling regulations? Margot put in the chat, I think you touched briefly on it, but just clarifying, if there's a change of government shortly, what happens to the co-administration agreements? And maybe just speak to the difference between the agreements and enabling regulations.
Thank you. Very good question. So it depends on would be leading the government. So if it was the Conservatives, they've proposed that they would repeal C-69, which is the Impact Assessment Act, as well as other pieces of legislation. So that might put at risk the opportunity for Indigenous Co-administration Agreement regulations and the opportunity for First Nations to exercise those duties, powers, and functions in relation to impact assessments in their territories. But it's a risk. They might also choose to keep it, or they could make new legislation and integrate the same components because First Nations ask them to. But there's a degree of uncertainty. The current government has already demonstrated their support through passing the legislation and through advancing this particular process. I should note, separate, and we're not discussing it as a focal point today, but there is a similar process taking place in relation to the Canadian Energy Regulator, which is for pipes and international and provincial transmission lines. So there's more opportunities for that. So the challenge with the change in government is you have the uncertainty about whether or not this would move forward. It could fall apart. If you get it locked in as a regulation, it can still be changed by a subsequent government, but you would start to entrench it. You would make it harder for them to change. They'd have to go through an entire regulatory process. There would be transparency as opposed to just deciding not to move it forward.
Thanks, Jesse. And there's just a question in the chat. So Kim asked about an enabling regulation and said we must always have full transparency, and the government always plays around and changes things. This wouldn't be good. We would be back in long court. So maybe Jesse, can you speak to the requirement in the Act that a regulation be passed to allow for the negotiation of agreements to begin with, and then perhaps the kind of the difference in process for changes to a regulation versus policy that might implicate the ability to negotiate the agreements?
Certainly, and I thank Kim for the question. So basically on the process for promulgating a regulation, there's something called the Canada Gazette, which is kind of like the Government of Canada's newspaper. And in order to pass a governor and council regulation, which this would be, the opportunity exists for that to be published twice. And then that regulation would then become the law under the Impact Assessment Act. So it gets published, there's an opportunity for comments, it gets published again. And there are further opportunities for feedback about the particular regulations themselves. In the exercise of powers under the regulations, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change would still exercise the power to enter into agreements with Indigenous governing bodies, including, of course, First Nations. So those First Nations would have the choice of whether or not to sign into one of those agreements and whether or to withhold their signature and not enter into one or not pursue one. And similarly, the Government of Canada would. So the approach the agency has taken is to develop a circle of experts. That's where Ty and Aaron were from. Those guys sat down with the agency. They discussed a lot of the issues. They came up with a discussion paper. They've put that out into the world, said to the world, give us your best advice on how to do this. They're going to take that back and they're going to use that to formulate up regulations, which then would go through the regulatory process. So the idea that it might be of concern in terms of what the government could do, you could make regulations that lay out more specific content. It would take longer, it would require more discussion. You'd have to get to more solutions on these items, or you can create regulations that provide more of an umbrella and then allow the Mohawks of Kahnawake to choose a different path than the Mi'kmaq up in Cape Breton, and a different approach than the Secwepemc here in Kamloops. And it creates a greater flexibility. So the more you put in the regulations, the stricter you will be in terms of being held to those regulations. If you put in place enabling regulations, there is a bit more flexibility.
Thank you, Jesse. And I think we'll just wrap up and say that we will be drafting with Jesse's help and expertise a technical submission in response to the agency's discussion paper, and really keen to elevate any of the recommendations that folks on the line are hoping to have incorporated into the agency's proposals. And so would really encourage you all to reach out to me directly. I'm going to put my email address in the chat, and it's also listed on our website as well. And happy to continue the conversation with any of the folks here offline as well. We will be doing another webinar next week, kind of a what we heard and wrap up. And we won't have folks from the agency with us. I'll be leading that one and kind of setting out some of the things that we've heard from the agency, a kind of summary of what participants had shared and some proposals of what could be included in our technical submissions and also advocacy going forward. And just really want to acknowledge everyone for their contributions throughout the webinar series. We've had a lot of good engagement and discussion. And thank you all for being with us and contributing to the conversations that we've had so far. Jesse, was there anything else that you wanted to just reflect on before we turn to Elder Verna for our closing?
We'll very briefly just highlight, I think, 3 or 4 things that I would encourage everyone to think about and look at as they go through the discussion paper. One is the question of how do you deal with the requirement that you specify lands and the potential for overlaps. So thinking about what that might look like. Any Indigenous co-administration agreement regulations only apply to the lands that are specified. Thinking about how do you address capacity limitations in order to be able to actually do the work of administering and co-administering an assessment. As Aaron and the group discussed, what duties, powers, and functions would be most appropriate and most valuable to your First Nation. And then also whether or not there is a role for First Nations to play in substituted processes. So if the federal government says, we're going to let the provinces run this one, or potentially we're going to let Indigenous governing bodies run this one, what should that look like? And how should the interests of First Nations be addressed and the rights of First Nations be addressed in that context? But other than that, it is a pleasure to be with you all. I'm very excited about the opportunities that exist for First Nations to exercise greater influence in this space. And it's been a pleasure working with the AFN team to help advance this work.
Thanks, Jesse.
Sorry.
Elder Verna, can we go to you for our closing?
Yes, thank you very much. I like listening in here too as well, because for those of you who don't know too, I was part of this, the final session last year with the nuclear waste storage on the Ottawa River. And it's different too for us because we're unceded, meaning we never signed treaty. And that goes now back to the Royal Proclamation, where only development will begin under treaty. So here we are, we're not under treaty. So I said, so what about this proclamation? But the other part is also too as well the whole process of this, because our biggest concern is that it was less than a kilometer away from the Ottawa River, which is, and then Ottawa, the nation's capital, is just downriver, 160 kilometers downriver from Chalk River. So whatever happens, and they did have, Canada was the first nuclear accident in the world. It happened in 1952 and again in 1958. And it was the first major nuclear accident, and it registered a 5 out of 7 on the nuclear scale when this happened, but they didn't have the technology and knowledge back then as they do today. So Chernobyl registered 5 out of 7. So we were the first, or Canada was the first nuclear accident in the world. So that's why I take this impact assessment very important. And it's not just also for our people, but also it's for everybody, because it impacts not only the earth, but from this on the Ottawa River is the water, but the air as well, because the clouds did travel when Chernobyl happened, and it impacted the north. So again too as well, that's why our voices need to be louder, because it's still traditional lands. And so on that note, I say miigwech onje kigi pimachue kigi manjid nan wan onje nongum shwen mishnon widoko kakina pamazijik denizwa konje kin kimojan kakina kijemonedo kin kidebendan kakina shwen mishnon in abigis widoko kakina mamdege alkazajik tamagazajik we wisnajik ashich kaye we mi godwajik we don't go out. You want to key watch and abigus. Me gwach, me gwach, me gwach, me gwach. I just say really quickly, thank you for allowing us to meet here today and send look after our relatives who are also with us today, and look after the ones also that are sick, that need to eat, that are poor, and most also to the ones that are in conflict. And that it is also really, we call Galgijan Kakina is the maker of all things, which is what they call the Great Spirit, and that who's really in charge too. So I honor you for the work you do in impact assessment, because I think everything helps these days because it was foretold the times we're in now. And what's different about the people now in conflict today is that the weapons they use are also damaging, and they're permanently damaging. So impact assessment's good, and we need to also preserve our land, water, air for future generations. So miigwech, everybody, and I'll put tobacco down for everybody because I think we need it. So have a good evening in miigwech.
Miigwech, Elder Verna. Thank you, everyone. Take care.